Rome's brutal arena acts begins in the late Republic and flourished during the Empire, especially after the construction of the Colosseum in 80 AD. Public spectacles were not just entertainment, they were instruments of political control, designed to impress the masses, distract them from social problems, and glorify the power of Rome. These spectacles were known as ludi and munera, and while some were rooted in religious rituals and funeral games, over time they evolved into massive state-funded events of blood and violence. The Colosseum, officially named the Flavian Amphitheater, became the epicenter of these events. Its inauguration under Emperor Titus lasted 100 days, and according to ancient sources, thousands of gladiators, criminals, and animals were killed during the opening ceremonies. The Roman state invested enormous resources to make these spectacles grand and unforgettable, because they were a display of imperial generosity and dominance. Gladiators are the most iconic figures of the Roman arena, but the reality of their lives and deaths was far more brutal than the popular image of heroic warriors. While some gladiators were volunteers seeking fame and fortune, the vast majority were slaves, prisoners of war, or condemned criminals forced into combat against their will. For these men, the arena was not a stage for glory but a trap of violence with little chance of escape. Gladiatorial games were carefully staged to entertain the public. Fighters were trained in specialized schools, called ludi, where they endured harsh discipline, grueling routines, and constant fear of injury or death. Once inside the arena, the battles were rarely fair contests. Opponents could be mismatched deliberately to create more drama, with one fighter heavily armed and the other barely equipped to defend himself. Although not every gladiator fight ended in death, the pressure to kill was immense. The crowd demanded blood, and emperors seeking popularity often gave the people what they wanted. When a gladiator was defeated, his fate rested in the hands of the presiding official, usually the emperor or sponsor of the games. A gesture of thumbs up or down from the audience influenced the final decision, mercy or execution. For many, mercy was rare, especially when the event was intended to shock and impress. The most extreme moments went beyond one-on-one combat. Records describe instances where dozens of gladiators were forced to fight simultaneously in mass battles, turning the arena into a field of carnage. During the inauguration of the Colosseum, thousands of gladiators fought across multiple days, with casualties reaching staggering numbers. For the enslaved and condemned who fought as gladiators, death matches were not heroic contests but carefully orchestrated sacrifices to public amusement. Their lives were commodities owned by the state or private sponsors, valued only for how dramatically they could die. While some became celebrated figures, the vast majority were anonymous victims of a system that turned human suffering into the empire's favorite form of entertainment. One of the most disturbing elements of Roman arena culture was the reenactment of myths using real human victims. These were called fatal charades, theatrical performances where condemned criminals or prisoners were forced to play roles in famous stories, with their deaths scripted into the plot. Unlike ordinary plays, these productions ended not in staged illusions but in actual executions. The purpose was twofold: to entertain the crowd with dramatic spectacle and to degrade the condemned by turning their death into a grotesque parody of legend. The Roman audience, familiar with Greek and Roman mythology, found both excitement and dark humor in seeing these tales brought to life with real blood. Examples recorded by ancient sources are shocking. One condemned man, dressed as Icarus, was flung from a high platform in the arena to his death, imitating the mythical fall after flying too close to the sun. Another criminal was forced to act as Hercules and then burned alive, mirroring the hero's fiery end. In some cases, women were included as well, playing mythological figures like Dirce, who was tied to a wild bull and dragged to pieces, while the crowd roared in approval. These spectacles blurred the line between theater and execution. Unlike gladiatorial combat, which at least carried the illusion of skill or chance, mythological reenactments offered no survival. The condemned were chosen specifically to die in horrific ways that matched the storyline. Costumes, props, and stage designs were used to make the deaths seem more dramatic, emphasizing the cruelty disguised as art. By combining myth with real bloodshed, Rome elevated cruelty to the level of performance. It was not enough for the audience to witness death, they demanded that it be staged as a narrative, as though the suffering of the condemned was part of a play written for their amusement. For the victims, there was no dignity in death, only humiliation, as their final moments were transformed into a grotesque spectacle mocking the very myths they portrayed. Beyond gladiatorial combat and animal hunts, the Roman arena also turned to the most gruesome forms of execution, burning and crucifixion, as a way to satisfy the public's appetite for spectacle. These punishments were not carried out in private as acts of justice but were deliberately staged in front of thousands of spectators, transformed into performances of cruelty. Crucifixion was already one of the most degrading forms of execution in Rome, reserved for slaves, traitors, and enemies of the state. In the arena, it was used to prolong suffering while the crowd watched. Victims were often nailed or tied to wooden crosses placed throughout the amphitheater. Unlike swift executions, crucifixion was designed to break the body slowly. Hours or even days could pass before death came through suffocation, exhaustion, or blood loss. For the Romans in the audience, this drawn-out suffering became part of the entertainment. Burning alive was another method adapted into public display. Criminals could be set on fire in the center of the arena, sometimes after being covered in flammable substances like pitch or oil. In certain cases, the executions were staged with theatrical flair, linked to mythological reenactments. For example, a condemned man might be dressed as Hercules and then burned to death in imitation of the hero's fiery demise, blurring the line between theater and execution. The cruelty lay not only in the method of death but also in the intention to humiliate. Victims were stripped of dignity, their final moments reduced to entertainment. Ancient writers note that the crowd's reaction was not horror but excitement, with cheers rising as flames consumed the condemned or as bodies hung suffering on crosses. By turning crucifixion and burning into spectacles, the Romans revealed the extent of their tolerance for public brutality. What was once meant as a punishment for the guilty became a ritual of death performed for amusement, showing how deeply violence was woven into the fabric of Roman public life.